Okay, today I'm going to talk about nuclear winter. While there will be a temperature drop in event of an all-out nuclear war, it will not be the extinction level event that Carl Sagan and his ilk, nor Andy Jacobsen feel that it will be. In their scenarios, looking in the northern hemisphere, the death toll will be like 99%, and probably around 90% in the rest of the planet. This scenario was first developed in the early 80s and described in a 1990 paper entitled Climate and Smoke, the Appraisal of Nuclear Winter. And in there, he said that the soot would be injected in the atmosphere, and within a couple of weeks, it'll be all around the Earth. It'll drop 22 degrees Celsius in mid latitudes and 10 degrees Celsius in more humid climates around the equator. 75% decrease in rainfall, light levels reduced basically up to 90% in the high smoke ejection levels, and it'll last like 1 to 3 years. Um, and with even temperatures even later towards that would be as low as 10 degrees, and the ocean temperature down around 6 degrees below normal temperature levels. Ozone depletion would be cut in half, which would release major skin cancer, cataracts, and other problems. Just watch threads for that showing there. So, so it's pretty grim stuff. And I was going, oh my God, I mean, we're doomed. There's no point trying to prepare. It's going to die anyways. Hopefully, I just basically drive towards the ground zero and hope it explodes on me and I die right away. Otherwise, I'll take the gun and put it in my head and blow my brains out. However, there's a lot of evidence that this scenario is incorrect. Uh, both, and that's both fundamentally related to calculations, but also in the change of the environment that we're going to have a nuclear war in. Or warheads are a lot smaller than they were back in the 80s, and we don't have as many of them as in the 80s. And there's also been sort of events of sort of contradicted the doomsday predictions. So I'll talk about that. Okay. Now, one interesting thing when they reiterated the model is they felt that 100 oil refinery fires would be sufficient to bring about a small scale, but still global nuclear winter. So when Iraq invaded Kuwait back in 1990, they threatened to set fire to all 800 oil wells, and the various nuclear winter people including Sagan and his friends, stated that that would be a catastrophic nuclear winter effect with continental size effects of sub-freezing temperatures as a result of the Iraqis going through with their threats of igniting even just 300 of these oil wells, and which could burn for months. Well, indeed, they did set fire to these wells in March of 1991, and about 600 of them were set ablaze. And they burned, some of them burned for as long as 8 months before they were stopped. And basically, at their peak, they were burning off 6 million barrels of oil per day. However, given that it was like twice as many as they said that would trigger a catastrophic global nuclear winter-like effect, it didn't. The effects were far more modest. They were just local, very temporary drop of 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. Still nasty, but it was temporary. So, it wasn't a crippling effect. It was localized to the Middle East. So, so much for that model. And then, although I haven't seen any writings to the effect, the wildfires in Australia a few years ago put a lot of soot into the air, and there was just effects around Australia, but they didn't be global all the way. So there are other assumptions too that have been challenged. If you actually read the book, it's actually available as a PDF. Nuclear War Survival Skills, written by Kristen Kearney for the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So this is an official government publication. In 1988, he said he criticized that. He said that the models assume an excessive amount of soot that would be blown into the stratosphere. He quoted a Soviet study that modern cities would not burn as firestorms, and its most flammable material would be buried under non-combustible rubble. So, we build cities differently than we did in World War II. So you wouldn't get the firestorms you would have in Hamburg and Dresden or Tokyo. And that there was a lot of overestimation of the size and extent of non-herbal wildfires that would start from a nuclear war, and especially if the war happened during winter or spring or fall when it's wetter. But even then, I mean, the bombs are smaller now, so the thermal energy doesn't go out as far, more limited, and just the sheer fire, the explosive power of that thing is not going to blow stuff way up into the atmosphere, into the stratosphere, the way the older multi-megaton weapons, because now our weapons range are between, 100 to 150 to 500 to 800 kilotons maximum. The Minutemen have 400 kiloton warheads. Uh, the new Sarmat that the Russians have can mount up to an 800 kiloton warhead, whereas back in the old days, in the 80s and before, our warheads were 1 to 5 megaton. A huge difference. So they also know that they assume quality of fuel underpinning these models were found to be too high. And instead they would intentionally create heat fluxes that left smoke in the lower substratosphere. So assessments more characteristics of conditions to be found in real world modern cities have found that fuel loading and hence the heat flux would result from efficient burning would rarely loft smoke much higher than about 4 kilometers, or that's roughly 3 miles into the atmosphere. That's less than the height of Mount Everest. So it's not going to go 20 miles up like they thought it would. And they looked at also, investigated a Siberian fire in 1915 that started early summer months due to a severe drought and burned down the world's largest boreal forest, an area the size of Germany, caught fire and burned. And 8 degrees of cooling were found underneath the smoke clouds, but just under there during the weeks of burning, but no increase beyond that, and no real increase globally. So there that is. And of course, there's also been more, worst case scenarios out there that have proven that it's not going to be as bad as that. And so we're going to see a drop in temperature. We're going to see some famine related to that, crop failures related to that. But it's nowhere going to be as bad as 99% of the population in the northern hemisphere dying off on us. The effects are not going to be as long, and we're probably going to lose more people. Actually, the collapse of the supply chain and the collapse of infrastructure, the loss of hospitals, sanitation, food distribution, these sorts of things are probably going to kill a lot more people than the actual nuclear winter itself. So, are there any like other real time models we can look at? Well, there's been the 1815 summer year without summer, which was due to a major volcanic eruption that dropped a few temperatures. It was cold. Uh, but the most of the populations did survive it. Same thing with during the 13th century. There was another situation like that, what they call a little ice age. And the worst was in the 6th century, and there were multiple volcanic eruptions, starting in 536 AD, and then the second one in 539, and the last one in 547. And the temperature dropped about anywhere from about 2.5 degrees Celsius to 4.5 degrees, Celsius, depending where you were. But it was known as the Little Ice Age too. There was a lot of famine and disease. It did kill tens of millions of people, but the majority of the population still survived, even in the Northern Hemisphere. It was a miserable time, but they survived. And remember, we're talking about people with low agricultural yields. Quite often monocrops. Subsistence farmers. It was after the collapse of the Roman Empire, so there was no way, no infrastructure for bringing food from unaffected areas or less affected areas to the more affected areas because again, the whole shipping was basically gone. Um, and of course, probably more people ended up dying from the diseases that came up after that, like the plague, than that. But again, most of the population survived, and that is the situation we'll find. Hundreds of millions will die, maybe several billion, but we will survive as a species. And in the southern hemisphere, actually, civilization itself will continue because they will not be as impacted as we are in the northern hemisphere. So that is my thoughts on global war, freezing from nuclear winter. So please like, comment, and subscribe.